Welcome to the Gospel of Peace, where we explore the radical, life-changing truth that God looks like Jesus. Hosted by Jerry Robinson, founder of True Riches Academy, join us as we uncover the heart of God's nonviolent love and discover how it transforms everything.
All right, friends, welcome to the Gospel of Peace podcast. My name is Jerry Robinson. It's great to have you here. You can find us online at truerichesacademy.com. There we have lots of podcasts and videos, articles we've written over the years. And this podcast episode here is we're going to be kicking off our new series entitled The Cross and the Sword, where we're going to be exploring guns, Christian nationalism, and really, quite frankly, the lost message of Jesus' nonviolent love of friends and enemies. I wrote an article that actually kicked off this series a little bit ago, and it was on our website. It actually is on our website. It's entitled, Why I Still Teach About Christian Nonviolence. I encourage you to check it out if you haven't. We got some great replies by email to that new article where we just really laid out the importance of teaching about nonviolence. This is something that is very important to me, something we've been talking about now for many, many years. It seems to me that if we don't address this head on as the body of Christ, that we're going to regret it. And we already have plenty of reason to regret it. We've seen lots and lots and lots of violence in the name of God all throughout time. But Jesus came to show us the error of that idea, and this is really what the series is all about. So if you're looking at today's episode title, I want you to know it's not meant to be funny. It's not a joke. I'm not trying to be sarcastic or cute. I really mean it. I'm asking honestly. The title of this episode is, Who Would Jesus Shoot? And again, it's not just sarcastic here. I mean, when you picture Jesus, do you ever imagine him armed with carnal weapons? Would you picture him carrying a handgun or an AR-15? Would you picture him aiming a bazooka at somebody or maybe even firing? And if that idea is uncomfortable or feels wrong to you, then I think that tells us something very important. I think deep down, we all know there's something very wrong about mixing Jesus and firearms together. Because honestly, I can't picture Jesus with a gun. I bet you can't either. I mean, I had one time somebody asked me, what would you do if you were forced to, deal with somebody who was, armed and coming at you? I just said, well, I would just do what Jesus would do, right? I'd blow his head off, right? And of course, that elicited nervous response, nervous laughter from the person who asked the question because they knew how absurd the answer is, right? But in America today, especially in some church circles, that idea that Jesus, the idea of Jesus carrying a gun, let alone using it upon his enemies, isn't as uncomfortable as it probably should be. We've taken the cross of Christ and somehow we have mixed it with the carnality of human weapons and the sword. And we've combined following the Prince of Peace with defending our personal rights through deadly force. And so today, I just want to talk openly about this strange brew that we have concocted here between Jesus and guns. And I want to be direct, but at the same time, I want to be humble. I want to challenge some of these assumptions head on, but I want to do it with grace. I'm not here to judge anybody. I'm not anybody's judge, right? That's the last thing on earth that I want to be. And I know that this can be a very uncomfortable topic. So as I talk about it, you may get the idea that I'm playing judge and jury, but I am not at all. I certainly don't want to do that. So what I want to do through this series and through this episode specifically is address this question. And let me just ask it one more time before we dive deeper into today's conversation. Who would Jesus shoot? Let's talk about it. So one of the strongest beliefs held by many American Christians today is that gun rights are God-given rights. You hear this a lot, right? That God gave us our freedoms, God gave us our Constitution here in the United States, God gave us our inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and somehow guns got included in that list. We've elevated guns right up there alongside these core freedoms, and now it's entirely understandable why many people think this way. When we hear something long enough, we start to believe it's true, especially when our culture repeats it over and over and over again. But I think it's important to make it clear that God didn't write the Second Amendment, right? He didn't hand deliver the Bill of Rights. People did, right? Politicians did. Men gathered in a room back in the late 1700s, and they debated these ideas. They argued about them, and then they voted on them. And then, yes, many of those men believed deeply in God. But here's the difference. The Constitution, as brilliant and helpful as it may be, is not Holy Scripture, right? Our rights listed there are rights that human beings decided were important. And they're rights that we can debate, that we can challenge, or we can even change if we choose. Jesus never once taught his followers to arm themselves with carnal weapons. He never told his disciples that they had a divine right to deadly weapons. In fact, we see the exact opposite message from Jesus. When Peter tried to defend Jesus with a sword in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus tells him, "Put your sword away. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword." That seems pretty clear, to me anyway. But as Christians, if we're serious about following Jesus, we have to measure every right that we claim against what Jesus actually said and did. Did Jesus ever suggest violent defense of personal rights? Of course not. Did he ever endorse homicidal violence as the way that his kingdom would come? Obviously, no. Right? And I want to clarify one more thing. This idea that guns and weapons come from God isn't just unique to America. We do take it to an extreme, I think, but it's certainly not unique to our country. Many nations and many religions believe that God has given them the sword. It's not new. It's as old as human history. This ancient myth of God-given homicidal violence, rights, is exactly what Jesus challenged during his earthly ministry. He invited his followers to something radically different. He called us into forgiveness and enemy love and turning the other cheek. He asked us to trust God more than our carnal weapons. So we need to be careful here. When we claim that gun rights are from God, when we say or claim that the Second Amendment was handed down to us by God, and that when someone tries to take away our right to a gun so that we can commit homicidal violence against our enemies, that would be stripping us of a God-given right. I'm telling you, I believe that we are mixing something into our faith that simply wasn't there to begin with. We are taking a man-made right and we're giving it divine authority. Isn't that exactly what the Pharisees did and what Jesus scolded them for? It's a dangerous myth that we have bought into when it comes to guns. And if we're not careful, guns can become an idol in our lives. And I know this is tough stuff, but it matters. So let's go further. So if we're going to talk honestly about Christians and guns, we have to look closely, of course, at Jesus, right? The one who we are called to follow. That's whose footsteps we say we want to walk in. So what did Jesus himself actually say? What did he do regarding homicidal violence and carnal weapons? Well, let's start with the most obvious moment. It's the night that Jesus was arrested. And you probably remember the scene. The soldiers come for Jesus in the garden, and Peter pulls out a sword and tries to defend Jesus. He even swings his sword at one of the men that is coming to arrest Jesus, one of the high priest's guards. And what did Jesus say? He scolds Peter. and then tells him, put your sword away. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Just think about what Jesus is saying right there. Just pause right there. Let that sink in. These are words that came directly from the lips of Jesus himself. And this isn't the only time that we see this from Jesus. Throughout his entire ministry, we never see him defend himself with violence or encourage his disciples to arm themselves with carnal weapons, right? It's something we never see. Instead, what did Jesus teach? He said things like, love your enemies. Well, you can't love your enemies and shoot them in the face, right? That's pretty clear. He tells us to do good to those who hate you. Okay, well, doing good isn't committing homicidal violence against someone, right? He says, pray for those who persecute you. Well, if you bomb your persecutors, you're not actually following that command, right? He told us to turn the other cheek when someone strikes us. This is incredibly different from the message that we hear today from the gun-toting American Christianity that looks very little, quite frankly, like Jesus and what he modeled for us. Jesus modeled these things for us. So just in case we don't know what he means, like, well, maybe that's spiritual. Well, how did he live? He never committed homicidal violence. He never encouraged anyone to commit homicidal violence, even to protect their rights, even to protect their life. And then he modeled it. When they beat him, he didn't reach for a sword. When they mocked him, he didn't call for their deaths. He forgave them. When they nailed him to a cross, he prays to the Father that the Father would forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. You know, even think about the early Christians, the early church. This is where it gets really interesting because the early Christians understood Jesus' words very literally. Right? The earliest Christians refused to pick up carnal weapons and to fight against their oppressors. They wouldn't even join the armies of the Roman Empire, right? They didn't defend themselves with homicidal violence, right? They literally turned the other cheek, even at the cost of their own lives. Tertullian was one of the earliest church fathers around the year 200, and he said it plainly. He said, the Lord, in disarming Peter, disarmed every soldier. So what Tertullian was getting at was simple, that if Jesus told Peter to put his sword away, he's telling us, all of us, to put our swords away too. Now, I can hear somebody saying, Jerry, that sounds completely extreme. And honestly, it kind of is. But Jesus' whole message was radical. It was never meant to fit neatly inside our comfort zones. It was supposed to challenge us and lead us to trust him in a totally different way. See, Jesus didn't just come to save us, as we've talked about so many times on this broadcast and also on our website and through our ministry. Jesus came to show us how to live. And when it comes to violence and carnal weapons, the example that he gave us is absolutely crystal clear. No swords, no homicidal violence, no killing enemies. Instead, Jesus chooses the cross, right? And tells us to follow him in choosing the cross. So as followers of Jesus, we have to decide what that means for us today, because the path he walked is the same path that he calls us to walk right now. Now, this leads us directly into another really important point. I want to talk openly about guns becoming idols here in America, right? Now, an idol isn't just some golden statue or silver statue or some ancient carving that we worship and we put on our mantles. An idol is anything that we place our ultimate trust in besides God, basically, right? It's anything that we cling to desperately because we think we need it more than we need Jesus. It's quite frankly the things that we turn to when we feel fear, right? And the truth is, for a lot of American Christians today, not all, but for many of them, guns have become exactly that kind of idol. So how do you know something is an idol in your life? Well, you can ask yourself a few questions. Number one, do I feel like I can't live without it? And I would say for many American Christians who are gun-toting American Christians, they feel as if they cannot live without a firearm, a loaded firearm. I know this because I used to be one of them. I didn't lay my gun down until 2016. I wasn't planning on hurting anybody. I just was prepared to kill someone before they killed me in the event that someone invaded my property or whatever. You know, that I had a view that just simply said, look, Jack, if you're going to try to attack me, I'm going to kill you first, right? But I can see as I look at it now, I can see that, yeah, I felt like I couldn't live without that gun. Another question you can ask yourself is, do I get angry and defensive or even fearful when someone challenges it or questions my devotion to it? And I would say that's exactly what we see here in America. When you bring up the right to a gun, there's a lot of defensiveness. There's a lot of fear and anger when someone challenges that quote-unquote God-given right. Another question you can ask is, do I put more confidence in this thing, in this case the gun, to keep me safe than I put in God himself? I mean, the answer is clearly yes, at least for how I used to be. In fact, I thought that God wanted me to have this gun so that I could protect myself, right? But of course, as I look back now, I can see that's not at all what Jesus was saying. It was something that the culture was saying and that I confused with God's voice. So if you answered yes to any of those basic questions about guns, then it's probably time for an honest heart check, kind of like I had to do back in 2016 before I laid my guns down. I had to think about how I was viewing this firearm. You know, there's a real uncomfortable reality lying underneath all of this, is that many Christians today treat guns as if they're sacred, right? They might even defend their right to guns more passionately than they defend the message of Jesus himself. At least that's what I used to do now that I can see it. And listen, that's a big problem, right? That's how you know that guns have crossed the line into idolatry. Think about the rich young ruler who came to Jesus. He said he wanted eternal life, right? But when Jesus told him, sell everything you have and give it to the poor and then follow me, what happens? Well, the young rich man walks away sad. Why? Because he couldn't let go of what he owned. His stuff had become an idol. It mattered to him more than following Jesus. And the truth is, for many Christians, as we're talking about here, if Jesus showed up today and said, look, I want you to lay down your weapons and trust me completely, I think a lot of us might walk away sad too. We've made weapons part of our identity here in the United States. We've made guns part of our security, and slowly, without even realizing it, we've placed our hope in something other than Jesus. But here's the good news. Jesus invites us into something so much better. He invites us into true security, true hope, true courage, not found in the barrel of a gun, but in the power of forgiveness, the power of love, the power of trust in him alone. Imagine what kind of witness we would be if the church was known not for how armed we are or how angry we are, but for how unafraid we are to love and forgive even when we're threatened. Many people view that as weakness. Friends, that's not weakness. It's real lasting strength, and that's exactly what following Jesus is supposed to look like. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground so far, but let's think practically for a moment here before we come to the end of today's episode. What kind of witness does the church have right now when it comes to this issue of carnal weapons and homicidal violence? What's the message that we're actually sending to the world? Because honestly, from the outside looking in, it seems pretty confusing. I mean, we say that we follow Jesus, the Prince of Peace, but we're often louder about protecting our guns and our rights to guns than we are about loving our neighbors, right? We're known more for defending our rights to deadly homicidal violence than for loving our enemies or laying down our lives. You know it and I know it. And I get it. That's probably not the intention most Christians have. It certainly wasn't the view that I had back whenever I thought that guns were fine. It was a fine thing for Christians to have and to rely upon and to trust in. But intentions aside, that's exactly how we're coming across to people who are watching us. So let's flip the question. What would happen if we took Jesus seriously on this issue? What if, instead of being known as the people who will shoot back and will kill you before you can kill us, what if the church became known as the people who refuse to retaliate? What if we were known for being brave enough to forgive instead of to fight to the death? What if, when the world looked at us, they saw a community that didn't trust in carnal weapons or in homicidal violence, but instead trusted deeply and completely in God's care? I think that kind of witness would be powerful, life-changing even, because it's unexpected, it's countercultural, it looks exactly like Jesus. And I know what some people might be thinking, again, but Jerry, what about protecting our families? What about keeping our community safe? How are we going to do that without our carnal weapons, without our commitment to killing before we get killed? Well, here's the thing. Choosing the way of nonviolence doesn't mean that we do nothing, right? It means that we rely upon God's wisdom and God's protection, and that we courageously refuse to respond to evil with more evil. It means that we take Jesus' teaching seriously enough to trust him even when it feels risky. I mean, early Christians did this. They refused to use homicidal violence against their enemies. They loved their persecutors. They prayed for their enemies. And guess what? Their radical trust in Jesus and following his way, the kingdom way, changed an entire empire. So maybe it's time we ask ourselves, what might happen if we dared to do the same thing today? We have the chance, friends, to show the world a better way, not through fear, not through homicidal violence, but through love and faith and a clear witness to Jesus. Friends, we're in the final moments here. Let's wrap up this episode. I know today's conversation is challenging. I know it pushes us outside of our comfort zones, but honestly, that's exactly what Jesus does, right? He challenges us. He shakes up our assumptions, and he asks us to look honestly at our own hearts, at our own motives. So I want to end by going back to our original question that I asked at the outset of this episode. And I'm asking it seriously, honestly, and humbly. Who would Jesus shoot? If we follow Jesus, if we really follow him, we seek to follow him, we need to be willing to answer questions like this openly, even when they feel uncomfortable or unpopular or completely absurd, as this question clearly sounds. The truth is that Jesus showed us exactly who he was and exactly how we were supposed to live. He lived without carnal weapons. He died forgiving his enemies. He rose from the grave and offered peace, not revenge, to the perpetrators behind his death. And if we claim to be Jesus' followers, we can't say that example that he set for us is some sort of option for us to choose, that there's another way we can go. No. His example is our foundation. So here's my encouragement to you today. Think deeply about this question. Think about the things we've talked about. Pray about them. Wrestle with them honestly. This is what I did many years ago, almost a decade ago now, as I was struggling with this topic. And I knew something was off about it. I knew something was wrong with the way that we were approaching firearms and homicidal violence and war. I knew there was something wrong. I just couldn't quite understand how to reconcile it with the way that I was reading the Bible. You don't just have to accept what culture or politics or even religious tradition has told you. Instead, look closely at Jesus. Let his words and example guide your convictions and your choices, because in the end, our witness matters. We're either telling the world that they can trust in homicidal violence, or we're showing them something better, something that looks a whole lot more like Jesus. My prayer is that you and I will choose wisely. Well, thanks for spending time with me today, friends. And friends, we're going to have more on this topic coming up. We're going to be talking about not only more about the gospel that has been compromised by a commitment to carnal weapons, but we're also going to talk about how the early church, get a little deeper into that story of how the early church understood Jesus' words on this topic. We're also going to get into the modern fusion of firearms and faith that has become known today as Christian nationalism. We're going to talk about how Christian nationalism is an entirely false gospel, and we'll talk about what happens when the church weds itself to state power. And we have a lot more to say on the way of peace, of course, right here on the Gospel of Peace podcast. Until next time, friends, stay safe, keep trusting God, keep following Jesus, and I'll see you next time. God bless.
You've been listening to the Gospel of Peace podcast with Jerry Robinson. To explore more teachings on the path of nonviolence and Christ-centered living, visit TrueRichesAcademy.com. Don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast with those seeking peace in a world of conflict. Until next time, remember, the way of peace is the way of Christ.